Napoleon Bonaparte, European Conquest. What happens when a short Corsican with a thick accent and a thirst for glory decides Europe is simply too small for his ambition? Imagine this. A man who crowned himself emperor, installed his brothers as kings like they were action figures, and marched across continents with armies so massive they made the Holy Roman Empire vanish like a puff of powdered wig. But how did Napoleon go from being bullied at military school to rewriting the laws of Europe? Why did he drag scientists into battlefields and loot museums like a history-loving pirate? And what made him think invading Russia, yes, Russia, in winter was a good idea? This is not just a story of conquest. It's a tale of obsession, betrayal, brilliance, and downfall. From the blood-soaked fields of Austerlitz to the frozen wastelands of Moscow, from the grandeur of self-coronation to the lonely exile on St. Helena, Napoleon's journey is a masterclass in ambition and hubris. If you love stories that crack open the past and spill out drama, ambition, betrayal, and brilliance, then Dark Crown Chronicles is your new sanctuary. By subscribing and turning on notifications, you're not just following a channel. You're unlocking a vault of epic tales, cinematic storytelling, and deep dives that make history feel dangerously alive. So buckle up, history lovers, because this isn't just about battles and borders. It's about how one man tried to bend the entire continent to his will, and almost succeeded. Napoleon was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, which had just been snatched from Genoa by France. So yes, he was technically French, but only in the way a pineapple pizza is technically Italian. He grew up speaking Corsican and Italian and didn't learn French until he was 10. And when he did, oh boy, his accent was so thick you could spread it on toast. At military school, the Parisian boys mocked him for sounding like a goat herder and for being, well, tiny. They called him the Little Corsican. He was short, yes, but not that short. At about 5'7", he was perfectly average for the 18th century. The myth of the Napoleon complex, that came later, courtesy of British propaganda and insecure tall men. But here's the twist. While the other boys were busy bullying, Napoleon was busy reading. He devoured books on history, strategy, and leadership like they were croissants. His brain became a battlefield of ideas, and he earned a scholarship to a military academy. From poor island kid to elite cadet, he was already rewriting his destiny. In 1785, Napoleon entered the French army as a second lieutenant. Then came the French Revolution, a chaotic blender of liberty, guillotines, and committees that couldn't agree on lunch, let alone governance. Napoleon, ever the opportunist, rose through the ranks like a rocket strapped to a baguette. By 1793, at just 24, he was a brigadier general under the Committee for Public Safety, ironically named since they were mostly known for executing people in the name of keeping them safe. But Napoleon played the game well. He was brilliant, ruthless, and knew how to win battles and flatter egos. In 1798, Napoleon took an entire army to Egypt, not for the pyramids, but to mess with Britain's trade route to India. But he didn't just bring soldiers. He brought scientists, linguists, artists, and scholars. It was like invading with a TED Talk. The Egyptians were intrigued by the intellectuals, but horrified by the French soldiers' drunkenness and lack of manners. Napoleon, ever the chameleon, declared himself a fan of Islam, purely for PR. Meanwhile, he plundered Egyptian artifacts like a kid in a candy store with no adult supervision. Statues, scrolls, mummies, you name it, he looted it. And this wasn't a one-time thing. He'd go on to collect treasures from Italy, Austria, and anywhere else he marched. Napoleon didn't just love artifacts. He loved what they said about him. That he was cultured, powerful, and destined to be remembered. Spoiler, he was right. In 1799, after his Egyptian adventure turned into a sandy disaster, Napoleon returned to France. Perfect timing. The Directory, a 5-man committee trying to run France, was failing miserably. The economy was a mess, wars were everywhere, and the people were tired of chaos. Napoleon staged a coup, tossed the Directory into history's recycling bin, and declared himself first consul. Then he made peace with the Catholic Church via the Concordat of 1801, which basically said, you get religion, I get loyalty. Smart move. Even dictators need allies. But he didn't stop there. In 1802, he became consul for life. And in 1804, he crowned himself emperor. Yes, crowned himself. The Pope was there, but Napoleon snatched the crown and placed it on his own head. Subtle. He styled himself like a Roman emperor. Laurel wreaths, statues, busts, and furniture that screamed, "I am the state." He even inspired fashion trends. Women wore slim white dresses like Roman goddesses, and homes were decorated in empire style. It was a full aesthetic takeover. Napoleon didn't just crown himself, he franchised his empire. Brothers were handed kingdoms like party favors. Joseph got Spain, Louis got Holland, Jerome got Westphalia, and poor Lucien got ignored because he had the audacity to marry for love. But not everyone was dazzled by the Bonaparte brand. Enter Germaine de Staël, the intellectual powerhouse and richest woman in Europe. At first, she was intrigued by Napoleon. She even tried to flirt with his ego, asking what kind of woman he admired. His answer? The one with the most children, while staring at her chest like a man who'd just discovered gravity. Germaine was not amused. She went from curious to crusader, denouncing Napoleon's tyranny to anyone with ears. He exiled her, of course, because that's what you do when someone's smarter and sassier than you. Napoleon didn't just want France. He wanted everything. Europe was his chessboard, and he was playing 4D war. He drafted young men aged 20 to 24, then earned their loyalty by actually fighting beside them. 60 battles. That's not a general, that's a gladiator with a map. He defeated Austria at Austerlitz in 1805, a battle so decisive it made military historians weep with joy. Then came Prussia in 1806 and Russia in 1807. Boom, boom, boom. And with each conquest, he didn't just plant flags, he planted reforms. Serfdom, abolished, religious tolerance, legislated, schools for science and tech, founded, Napoleonic code and metric system, imposed like a very polite bulldozer. Ah yes, the metric system, the elegant, logical way to measure things. Unlike the imperial system, which was clearly invented by someone juggling spoons and yelling numbers. Stan's right, it's very European, like soccer, universal healthcare, and not putting cheese in aerosol cans. But here's the twist. Napoleon's reforms, while modernizing, also sparked something unexpected: nationalism. People in conquered lands didn't want to be French. They wanted to be not French. Germans started thinking of themselves as Germans, partly because they were tired of being ruled by Napoleon's brothers. I mean, if you're going to live under a dictator, at least get the original. Not the guy who looks like him, but can't remember your capital city. It was like buying tickets to see Beyoncé and getting her cousin Brenda instead. Napoleon's grand plan to colonize all of Europe hit a snag in Spain. The continental system, his economic blockade against Britain, was being undermined by Spanish and Portuguese trade. So in 1807, Napoleon sent 100,000 troops to fix that. The Spanish and Portuguese royals fled their capitals faster than you can say adios, but the Spanish people didn't roll over. They launched a brutal guerrilla war that would bleed Napoleon's forces dry and inspire resistance across Europe. Spain became his Vietnam, and it was just the beginning of the unraveling. Napoleon installed yet another brother, Joseph, as king, and resistance swelled, with help from the British and Arthur Wellesley, who would later become the Duke of Wellington. And you can see the effects in art. Jacques-Louis David painted triumphant moments in Napoleon's career, including his self-coronation as emperor. But Spanish painter Francisco Goya depicted Napoleonic rule as a reign of terror. His 3rd of May 1808 shows a French firing squad mowing down peasants and clergy alike. Goya remained a chronicler of Spanish resistance and French barbarism, as tens of thousands of French troops had to occupy the conquered kingdom because of Spanish hatred of the conquerors. Let's go to the thought bubble. Despite ongoing problems, Napoleon became determined to conquer and absorb all of Russia, especially since it had opted out of his continental system. He built an army of some 600,000 to 700,000 men from across his lands and began his invasion in June of 1812. Having trudged hundreds of miles, troops were exhausted and overcome by the heat, and the Russians refused to engage in battle. Instead, they retreated, practicing so-called scorched earth tactics by burning and destroying any resource, including food and livestock, that could be of use to the invaders. Finally, at Borodino, the two sides engaged in what was ultimately a costly victory for the French, who lost 30,000 men, while the Russians lost 45,000. But the French were thousands of miles from home territory, and so reinforcing and resupplying their army proved difficult. Foreign recruits, who were not as loyal to Napoleon, began melting away as winter approached and conditions worsened. The remaining 100,000-ish invaders marched on from Borodino, some 70 miles from Moscow. But on reaching their destination, they found the city consumed by fire. Shelter and other necessities were once again in short supply. Still, Napoleon waited for Tsar Alexander I to surrender and agree to terms. But when the surrender failed to materialize, Napoleon led his depleted, starving, and frostbitten army westward to Poland. Many had died, many other soldiers had deserted, and more French troops would be killed by the Cossacks as they retreated. Only 40,000 of Napoleon's soldiers reached Poland alive in 1813. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So the European powers took note of the emperor's bedraggled forces and formed a coalition that included Russia, Austria, Prussia, and Sweden. In 1813, their armies, backed by British financing, defeated French forces at Leipzig. This battle was waged because Napoleon refused to accept the Allies' terms, which initially allowed him to continue to rule France. In early 1814, he abdicated and headed for exile on Elba, an island in the Mediterranean. A year later, he escaped, returned to France, gathered an army, and confronted the powers once more, finally surrendering on July 15, 1815, after being defeated at Waterloo. July 15, 1815. Napoleon was living in exile on the distant island of St. Helena when he died on May 5, 1821, 32 years to the day after the meeting of the Estates General that set the French Revolution into motion. Consider all that had happened in those 32 years, and you'll understand why this period of French history is seen as so important to world history. Decades after his death, Napoleon's remains were lavishly returned to France, placed in the Church of the Dome in the heart of Paris, and eventually re-encased in a grander sarcophagus under the church's golden dome itself. Why? Remember that under him, French achievements were massive in terms of education, commitment to science, standardization, modernization of the economy and administration, and opening the door to opportunity for ordinary people. Well, ordinary men. French museums were packed with loot from across Europe and Egypt plundered by Napoleon's armies. In fact, those museums are still packed with that loot. And there were also the unforgettable early military victories and the revival of French cultural glory that led to the imitation of French things throughout the world. Muhammad Ali, ruler of Egypt, who had been part of the effort to drive Napoleon and his forces from the country, would begin programs in direct imitation of Napoleon's. And the creation of a truly citizens' army, entranced by the heroism of its leader, also endured, while his lightning attacks remained a model to future military innovators. The Napoleonic Code was imitated worldwide. As Napoleon's body was re-entombed in splendor and pomp, one worker expressed France's general worship of the dictator. "I've got the emperor in my guts. For better and for worse, we still have Napoleon in our guts." Before you go, don't forget, if you enjoyed this wild ride through history's most dramatic dictator saga, make sure to follow us, subscribe, and smash that notification bell so you never miss another story packed with intrigue, wit, and a touch of scandal.